so much. I guess I'll sit down if that's okay. I'm so pleased to be here today to share with you why I've become so committed to and immersed in the movement to challenge Islamophobia and anti-Arab racism, to discuss some of the ways that Islamophobia manifests itself, to look at it in the broader context, and to consider different strategies for combating it. My comments this afternoon come from the perspective as a Jewish American partner in this work, who's concerned with Islamophobia in general, and also concerned with the ways my community, the Jewish community, perpetuates and or responds to Islamophobia. As it was mentioned, I'm part of a group, Jews Against Anti-Muslim Racism, which was created to join the broader Muslim-led movement against Islamophobia and also to engage with my own community around these issues. I am one of many, many different voices speaking out on this issue. To provide some context, there is consistent organizing spearheaded by Muslim groups, both local and national, around issues of Islamophobia, white supremacy, and racist violence. The groups I am part of and many other organizations engage as partners in this organizing to join with Muslim communities in demanding human and civil rights for Muslim and for all communities. We know, and we can see it all around us, that Islamophobia has become an entrenched feature of our national landscape. We see this most recently in the administration's appointment of rabid Islamophobes, like the recent nomination of Mike Pompeo for Secretary of State and the selection of John Bolton as National Security Advisor. In the Muslim ban that specifically targets Muslim communities in US domestic and foreign policies, and in the supposed war on terror that also target Muslim communities, and in countless other ways. Islamophobia has many dimensions and layers to it. The virulently Islamophobic clash of civilizations concept, which depicts Muslims as belonging to a violent and inferior culture, provides the ideological foundation for US policies and actions that are rooted in a dangerously false anti-Muslim framework. Many people, including a group of scholars and activists who developed a syllabus called Islamophobia is Racism, understand Islamophobia as anti-Muslim racism, which in their words, and I quote, more accurately reflects the intersection of race and religion as a reality of structural inequality and violence rooted in the longer history of US and European empire building, unquote. While we need to organize against Islamophobia and racism reflected in the current administration's policies, we must also analyze and constantly challenge what's known as liberal Islamophobia. Liberal Islamophobia is when individuals or groups oppose individual acts of Islamophobia, such as hate crimes, but then support systemic policies and programs that target Muslims and those perceived to be Muslim. Liberal Islamophobia, like all forms of Islamophobia, is pervasive, including among many of us who consider ourselves progressive and who want to be principled partners in challenging Islamophobia. Author Deepa Kumar writes compellingly about liberal Islamophobia, and I quote her words, "At the end of the day, liberal imperialists, for all their talk of speaking softly, accept the logic that the US can and should intervene anywhere it wants to around the world to pursue its interests with no respect whatsoever for the self-determination of the people in the countries it targets. Liberal Islamophobia is still racist at its core," unquote. While there are many, many examples of liberal Islamophobia to underscore, one striking example that's so common in Western societies like the US that consider ourselves liberal is the view that Muslim women are victims or are oppressed in need of saving or rescuing from a sexist religion and culture. This is consistent with the notion of the US needing to bring freedom to backward countries. In actuality, These views have been repackaged and reframed again and again to justify colonialism and occupation. And as Sunaina Mehra writes, it is yet, quote, another case of white men and white women trying to save brown women from brown men, unquote. One really can't overstate the extent of the othering or caricaturing of Muslim women in both mainstream and liberal Islamophobic discourse that ignores and distorts the breadth and depth of their lived experiences. I also can't not mention a recent example of gendered Islamophobia. The prosecution that I'm sure many of you read about and followed of Noor Salman, who was acquitted on all charges for aiding and abetting her husband, Omar Maten, in the Pulse massacre. As co-director of Justice for Muslims collective, Darakshan Raja writes, for many women, it is chilling to know that this prosecution was even allowed to take place. The terrible tragedy at Pulse was exploited by a deceitful prosecution and the FBI to depict Salman as a terrorist supporter when she was no more and no less than a survivor of a domestic abuse at the hands of a mass shooter, unquote. So there are many different Muslim communities that have been impacted by Islamophobia and racism. As anthropologist and activist Donna A. Austin points out, the third of the Muslim community that is Black, and she says, I quote, exists right at the intersection of two forms of racism, Islamophobia and anti-Black racism. Also, while 9/11, we all know that 9/11 is a critical marker in this country's history of Islamophobia, writer and professor Edward E. Curtis IV explains that, quote, African American Muslims do not fit neatly into post-9/11 anti-Muslim narratives, unquote. Black Muslims in the United States have experienced slavery, white supremacy, and pre-9/11 government surveillance. And so for them, as well as for many Arab Americans and other Muslims, Islamophobia in the United States started well before 9/11. So I'd like to turn my focus now on a few issues that relate to the work I've been connected to. One of the ways that Islamophobia often manifests itself in some Jewish communities, as well as some others, is through dividing Muslims into two categories: those who are considered to be good Muslims and those who are considered to be bad Muslims. Islamophobic assumptions are at the heart of this good Muslim and bad Muslim paradigm. The term was introduced in relation to the, quote, war on terror by Mahmoud Mamdani, who wrote Good Muslim, Bad Muslim, America, the Cold War, and the Roots of Terror. He explained that it rests on this premise that post 9/11, quote, unless proved to be good, every Muslim is presumed to be bad. All Muslims are now under an obligation to prove their credentials by joining in a war against bad Muslims, unquote. And this assumption also extends to Arabs, who are often all conflated with Muslims, and to all those who are perceived to be Muslims, because many who are perceived to be Muslims but who are actually not Muslim are also part of this. So what ends up happening? I'll speak specifically about how the good Muslim, bad Muslim paradigm plays out among some Jewish organizations, but other groups employ it as well. Many groups will work only with Muslim or Arab American groups that do not or agree not to publicly criticize Israeli policies. And they insist that these Muslim and Arab American groups explicitly and publicly denounce anti-Semitism, criteria that Christian groups, for example, that are potential partners are not asked to do. Also, many Jewish groups will only work with Muslim and Arab American organizations that publicly disassociate themselves from any Arab or Muslim groups or individuals that have been accused of supporting pro-Palestine groups or having any alleged connections to Hamas or to terrorism. And having evidence, by the way, is not required. So groups that use this kind of a litmus test are trying to dictate which Muslims and Arab Americans are suitable to work with while discrediting all others. And this kind of scrutiny, it's based on lies and half-truths and distortions that are put forth by those who are promoting Islamophobia and anti-Arab racism, and sometimes by those who don't really examine how this litmus test contributes to Islamophobia and anti-Arab racism. So while we often hear public pronouncements made about the importance of working in coalition with Arab and Muslim Americans and how important interfaith work is, that commitment is often deeply compromised by the good Muslim, bad Muslim paradigm, which makes it impossible to really engage in meaningful work together that's rooted in true respect for one another. So I think it's important to understand how this paradigm plays out and to really address it and challenge it directly. So I'd like to talk briefly about what's been called the Islamophobia network in America. The Center for American Progress revealed, through extensive research, that there's a tightly networked group of misinformation experts guiding an effort that reaches millions of Americans through partners in the media, strong advocates, increasingly strong links to our government, to the US government, and various mainstream institutions and organizing on the ground. Members of this network have engaged in many of the major Islamophobic campaigns we have seen in recent years all over the country, in Boston, in New York, in Chicago, in Denver, in Tampa, in Seattle, in New York City. And in our research, my colleague Ellie Bolkin and I just documented the way in which those who fund the Islamophobia network here in the US are also funding right-wing and settlement projects in Israel. The connection between the Islamophobia funders and Israel is quite strong. The funders and groups they support overlap in many ways. They further a rabidly anti-Muslim climate, and its members bolster state-sponsored anti-Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian policies put forth by the US government. So they work very much in interaction with one another. So how do those of us who are partners in this work, in my case, member of Jewish organizations, interact with this work? What's a positive way to do it and to become involved with it? While Islamophobia has a long and ugly history way before 9/11, I think for many of us from outside the Muslim community, our activism and awareness about what Islamophobia is and how it manifests itself may be more recent. For some of us after 9/11, for some of us since this recent administration came to power. For me, it was my involvement more than a decade ago with a Muslim principal of an Arabic dual language school in New York City who lost her position because of a sustained Islamophobic campaign directly related to Israel politics that brought this issue to my attention. Before that, I had never seen or understand so dramatically the many dimensions of Islamophobia. And while the rabid Islamophobes did their job and their damage and had a major campaign against her, the real damage was in fact done by the mayor's office and the Department of Education. Those are government institutions that capitulated to the demands of these Islamophobes who demanded the principal's resignation. And I would like to say, since my husband isn't in the room, that he represented Debbie Almontasser, and the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission did end up ruling that she was discriminated against on the basis of race and religion. Is that correct? Similarly, although it was the anti-Muslim ideologues who stirred up fear and hatred of Muslims in New York City, it was a government official, the mayor, who endorsed police surveillance of the city's entire Muslim community. After 6 years of such spying in New York City, as well as in multiple states, the commanding officer of the New York City Police Department Intelligence Division acknowledged in court testimony that this surveillance program never generated a lead or triggered a terrorism investigation. There has been and there continues to be significant organizing that challenges Islamophobia, inspired by the leadership of those most impacted by its injustices. as we are seeing more and more intersectional organizing happening across communities, responding to the Muslim bans, to increased deportations of immigrant communities, to anti-Black racism and militarization of the police that threaten the lives and safety of so many communities. So as many of us in Jewish communities are engaging together in challenging Islamophobia, a number of principles have helped guide and frame our analysis and the work that we do. We want to be, particularly at this time, as visible as we can in our opposition to Islamophobia and anti-Arab racism, particularly within our own communities. Our goal is to stand together as principled, respectful partners with the Muslim community and all those impacted by Islamophobia. As we recognize the seriousness of individual acts in Islamophobia, which are beyond reprehensible and are intensifying in frightening ways, we also want to stress the damage and the extent of structural and state-sponsored Islamophobia, which often does not get addressed in the broader society. So while some liberal organizations will routinely oppose hate crimes against Muslims, as they should, many of those same organizations don't oppose or don't challenge, and sometimes even actively support state-sponsored surveillance of the Muslim community, like the global and the domestic war, quote, war on terror, that targets Muslim communities, all Muslims in the US, and that results in death and destruction to predominantly Muslim communities across the globe. So therefore, we're committed to opposing and making really visible our opposition to all forms of Islamophobia. We also understand that our work to challenge Islamophobia is part of a broader movement for justice and integrity for all communities. So for the past few Hanukkahs, which many of you may know is the Jewish Festival of Lights that takes place in December, in the midst of virulent anti-Muslim propaganda and violence, thousands of members of the Network Against Islamophobia, a project of Jewish Voice for Peace, and partners in cities across the United States, including here in Miami, organized actions rededicating ourselves to challenging Islamophobia and racism. We held signs in the shape of menorah, and I just brought one of the signs. So we have 8 signs that were like this, with the shamus, what's called, the large candle in the middle. And they all say different things. These 8 candles, everybody went to public spaces. In Miami, we did it on Lincoln Road, on Miami Beach on Lincoln Road. And so we conveyed such messages as, we will not be silent about, thank you, anti-Muslim and anti-racist hate speech and hate crimes. We condemn state surveillance of the Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities. We challenge through our words and actions institutionalized racism and state-sanctioned anti-Black violence. We protest the use of Islamophobia and anti-Arab racism to justify and perpetuate the Israeli government's repressive policies against Palestinians. We fight anti-Muslim profiling and racial profiling in all its forms. We call for an end to racist policing. We stand against US policies driven by the supposed war on terror that demonize Islam and devalue, target, and kill Muslims. And we stand strong for immigrant rights and for refugee rights. So this took place in cities across the country for the past 2 Hanukkahs, and it was joined, many groups came together, interfaith groups, and really stood together. We've also created posters, which I also brought, so that we could canvass our neighborhoods and communities. So I'm just going to show you for a second what the posters say, and I actually brought some here in case anyone wants them. This one says, "Standing with Muslims against Islamophobia and racism." This one says, "Stop profiling Muslims," and we actually made it at the time when there was increasing profiling of Muslims going on in airports across the country, and we also made t-shirts that we asked people who aren't being targeted to wear at airports when they fly. And we have "Refugees are welcome here," and we also have one that I just didn't have with me that says, "Immigrants and refugees are welcome here." So what we do, the canvassing campaign involves going to businesses and other storefronts to encourage store owners to put these in their windows and to be visible. And we've done it in many locations here in Miami. A number of immigrant rights and racial justice groups have come together to do this in Miami. And so what we do is, in addition to having, the reason we do it is in addition to having real visibility and making it clear that we have welcoming neighborhoods for all communities, it's really led to a lot of meaningful conversations and community building in different neighborhoods across the country. And again, this has been done in cities throughout the United States, tons and tons of cities throughout the United States. We know that for Muslims and those perceived as Muslims, there's no need to describe the seriousness and danger of Islamophobia. They experience it daily. But for those of us whose communities are not experiencing Islamophobia, I believe we must not ignore or minimize it wherever it exists, whether in our streets, whether by the media, whether at places of workshop, in our schools, in our communities, and of course by our government. Again, we know that Islamophobia and racism have a long history in the US. We also know that we are in a particular moment right now in which the vitriol is everywhere, and where white supremacists, including those with the power of the state behind them, feel emboldened to make visible and to enact however they can their violent and aggressive combination of racism, misogyny, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, trans and homophobia, and more. So as we engage in our work to challenge Islamophobia, we believe our role as members of Jewish communities standing for justice is to continue to speak out and stand strong from our different identities and within our communities in our opposition to Islamophobia in all its forms and manifestations, to challenge the Islamophobic narrative that falsely equates Islam and Muslims with violence, and to recenter the conversation of violence where it belongs, on the extreme pervasive violence of imperialism and occupation, to challenge ourselves about promoting, even unwittingly, a narrative that is rooted in Islamophobic assumptions and propaganda, and in all we do, to be rooted in generosity, in love, in compassion, and in a profound commitment to honoring one another's humanity as we engage in this journey together. Thank you. So there's time for questions if people have, yeah, are there any? And also if anybody, just want to say with these, the only thing we ask is that you put it in a visible place where others can see it, but just come up afterwards and feel free to take them. And if you're also interested in joining us whenever if we do it, you can I can put your name on a list and then I can send you the flyers when we're doing. So, okay, there was a question over there.
Yeah, I mean, it's having a hard time phrasing it, but basically, I noticed that oftentimes these forms of speech, homophobia, Islamophobia, racism, and whatnot, is often excused by large media institutions and people in the center as just like examples of like free speech, or like people say things like, oh, we're just having like a conversation, right? And so I'm just wondering how how you frame like how we bring opposition to these like kind of grotesque speech acts without seeming like, oh, you're anti-free speech, or that kind of like red herring, you know what I mean?
Yes, I know exactly what you mean. So I do want to say, and again, I don't want you to think I'm like giving a plug for my husband here, but I want to tell you, he just actually gave a talk on this exact topic at Evergreen College in Washington State, because they were having a lot of problems, and other campuses are now having him speak on it, because he's a constitutional and civil liberties lawyer who does not believe that Islamophobes and white supremacists should be in certain spaces on college campuses. And one thing to make clear is that, for example, when you are inviting somebody, in my case, to our synagogue, it's not a First Amendment issue. This is not about government. First Amendment has to do with government speech. That's a very different issue. When we talk about bringing in speakers to our institutions, we have a right to bring in who we want, and it's not just who we invite, but it's who we don't invite. So we make decisions all the time about who we want. So I have tremendous respect for students who have protested in every way they can to stop some of these virulent white supremacists from speaking on college campuses, because the harm that they are doing is not harm that students should have to be engaged in. And that's not about free speech. That's about enabling students to actually have a learning environment where their voices and who they are respected and recognized. And when you have people calling them subhuman, calling students subhuman, that's not giving students the right to really have their voices heard. So I think but I think it is very important because sometimes people use, and I have learned this a lot from Alan because he's always saying you've got to distinguish between what's the government speech and what speech that we all are entitled to have or not have in a campus, in universities, in our synagogues, in our churches, and in other public spaces. So that's why we think it's when Pamela Geller, who's many of you have heard her name, who's one of the worst Islamophobes. I mean, there's so many of them now, but she's been out there. She put signs on New York City subways so that you see these signs when you go on the subways, and it says, calling Muslims savages and these very horrifying signs. And many of us realize that you go on a subway, you shouldn't have to see these signs. And so, in some sense, she had the right to do it, but many people went on and put, when they could, stickers over it that said hate speech. And one writer wrote about it because people were saying these are vandals. Well, someone wrote in the Nation magazine, she said, I call them scribes. They were scribes who were doing this. So I think it's important to think about what's our responsibility. And I'm Jewish and my family goes back to, I grew up learning about the Holocaust in Nazi Germany. I wish to God, I would have been thrilled. People were like out on the street saying, don't do this to Jews. And it's like, never again, which is what I was taught, means never again for anyone. And that means, I'm going off your question, but just to say that I think that it's so easy to and many of the people who are behind these free speech arguments are not really concerned with free speech. They're concerned with censoring the speech of progressives and leftists and people of color and Muslims and others. So we have to also be clear about that. If you look at the agenda behind many of these free speech advocates, there's a lot of reactionary resources and positions behind that. So Alan, did you want to add anything?
Shouldn't have said it.
Yes.
Thanks, very interesting. I'm David Skiff, I'm on the staff here at FIU, and we are right now announcing to the world our Center for Muslim World Studies, which is now called the Jaffer Center for Muslim World Studies. And up until we got the leadership gift from the Jaffer family to name the center, more than a third of our donations to make this a reality came from non-Muslims. And in fact, we have a society called the Al-Andalus Society, which is for non-Muslim givers. And I would really appreciate being able to communicate with you sometime later and ask you for some advice on narrative to help reach out to non-Muslims to tell them about the importance of the community coming together on this subject.
Well, I would love to talk more to you about that, and also congratulations for what you're all doing here. I got to have lunch with Iqbal and some other people who are here, and I just have to say that I grew up in Miami, and then I've been in New York for a lot of years, and now I'm back here, and FIU has always been really special to my heart, and I think when I've met students, they've always been amazing, and when I've met faculty, they've always been amazing, so I'd love to be connected in any way that would be valuable for you all, because it would be valuable for me for sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yes?
Can I have one poster? We have another meeting that they have to go.
Oh, you have to go to, of course, just come take one.
I'm part of the center working on refugees at FIU. The center is still new. We just started it. We are calling it an initiative for working with forced migrants, international forced migrants, and refugees is a biggest part of it. And again, I would be happy to be.
You would like the refugee post, absolutely.
Yes, for our center.
That would be great. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It was amazing.
Great, thank you. Any other thoughts or questions or? Yes.
Has it been challenging, or I'm sure it's a complex answer, but I'm Jewish too, and
thinking of people like Pamela Geller, like in our community, is to me it's just very hard to fathom. So I was wondering if the lessons of the Holocaust and just things that we've been brought up with as Jews have translated well into organizing and getting people to be allies, or has some just unavoidable things that we've grown up with as Americans, like this racism and Islamophobia some of us have been taught, has that gotten in the way?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a good question. And I think there's a lot of both. I think I was saying earlier at lunch that for some of this work, a number of years ago, there were groups meeting with similar values, and there were a small group of people in a room. I'm talking about Jews who were getting together. Today, whether it's for justice in Palestine and Israel or challenging Islamophobia, it's growing and growing and growing, the movement for justice. And so I think many, and particularly among younger people, truthfully, although there are some people in our generation too, but I think it's growing particularly among younger people who are recognizing that the values of justice and equality aren't exactly aligning with what some of the mainstream groups are doing or what the Israeli government is doing, and what the US is supporting through that. And I think so one of the things I think that's happened is a lot of groups are being created saying either not in my name, or whether it's in Israel, the Israeli government doesn't speak for me, or that in this country we stand together with Muslim communities, with the movement for Black Lives, with others, with indigenous communities. And so, but I think it is growing and growing, and I think there's a disconnect. And one of the things I've learned over the years is that even though these Jewish organizations claim to speak in our name, they actually don't really have that many people who are, they've got resources, they've got funding, there's definitely, good PR. But I do think if you look at communities, there's a lot of change taking place. So I do feel, in that regard, I do feel hopeful, although, there's Jews like all people. I don't think there's more good values in being Jewish than there is in any other religion or community. I think you draw the best of your tradition. I say I draw the best of my, I grew up with parents who were so deeply ethical, and so for me being Jewish meant how they were and who they were, because that's what they taught me being Jewish was. But I know lots of people who were brought up with different values. So we do know it can go in, and so we don't want to exceptionalize any community, but we want to draw from the best of our own communities as we build with others, if that makes sense. So I'd love, yes?
Well, can you explain more what exactly you're doing when something happened not in the United States, in Israel? For example, we talked about it before about what's going on in Gaza, about the Khilaf. If there is anything in your group doing something against this, or writing, or willing to go to them, what exactly? Can you tell me more about that?
Well, I think there's
16 people were killing in Gaza.
Yeah.
The media was not talking about it.
If people had followed, there was a peaceful march among Palestinians for Land Day. We're coming up on the 70th anniversary of the Nakba, which is known as the catastrophe, when 750,000 Palestinians were expelled from their land and from their home when Israel was created. And so it was a really very powerful, beautiful coming together that was met with unbelievable violence and brutality by the Israeli government, with killings and also people ending up injured and then being prevented from getting medical care when they were injured. So our group, we're on our way to New York City today, and tomorrow there's a big march of all the groups coming together to stand with the Palestinians against what's going on. I know there is some organizing amongst groups in Miami that are doing things. More recently, groups have been coming together to kind of try to do their work together and to strengthen what we're doing, so that is happening in Miami. And if people are interested, I can also get you on a mailing list that started circulating when there's actions taking place. For Jews, I think we're also trying to push our own organizations. So for example, we've come out and said, the Anti-Defamation League is a Jewish organization that is considered by many as a liberal organization. In fact, the ADL promotes Islamophobia, targets Muslim and Arab activists, and has since the 1970s. Anybody who's pro-Palestine is, it's a really I mean, I'm not being articulate right now, but we have a lot written down and documented about the role of the ADL. So we think as Jews, we have to also hold our own communities accountable, because we don't want an organization like the ADL that says, oh, we're against Islamophobia on one hand, but on the other hand is doing, you know, doing trainings or supporting surveillance of the Muslim community or targeting groups in different ways. My colleague and I actually did a piece on, Ellie Bolkin is the person I do a lot of my work with, and we did a piece on looking at the ADL and the role they've played in fomenting Islamophobia. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think so we try to work in two ways, as part of the broader movement and also to do the work deep in our own communities. I'd love to hear if anyone has any thoughts or anything too. It doesn't have to be a question.
This is such a huge issue that you're talking about. The ability to talk about human beings outside the context of politics and preconceived notions and buzzwords. And here in Miami, we have such a large, influential Jewish population, and it's frequently very difficult for anybody, Jew or Gentile, Muslim, whatever, to talk about issues like the Palestinian issue, because you simply mention the word, and the person will immediately be assumed to be anti-Israel or anti-Semitic. You know, it's very difficult just to simply look at the issues, and I don't know if there's what we can do to improve this, so that it's sort of a middle road where we're talking about human rights and peoples instead of all of the flash words that are attached to that. I don't know if I'm making
No, you are, and I would love to address this issue for a minute about anti-Semitism, because I don't know if others have had the experience when trying to speak out. I find it extraordinarily troubling because, for one, when you're accusing people who are critical of a nation state, or critical of policies of a nation state, to be anti-Semitic, it falsely targets people, so that's wrong in and of itself. Two, what about real anti-Semitism when it does appear? It's just, it is so disrespectful to what real anti-Semitism is. But of course, worst of all, is it's used to silence and intimidate people who are trying to stand for justice and for human rights. So that's why more of us are coming together, because we need to be able to know that, like, we're not going to, and again, these are very right-wing groups, and they target people, and they go on campaigns against people. This principal, Debbie Almentasser, was like the poster child to run a school. She was one of New York City's most respected educators. The Islamophobes went on an attack on her, and we see it time and time again, and so people become really scared to speak out. But I think we need to just keep coming back. Jewish Voice for Peace, that I'm part of, we just put out a book on anti-Semitism to talk about what is real anti-Semitism versus what are these false accusations of anti-Semitism. But that's the way to get people to intimidate and silence. And it's happening across the country. There's a group that got created, an organization called Palestine Legal, that literally is addressing campuses across the country and the problems that they're having. Alan right now is representing a group of students at Fordham University who were creating a Students for Justice in Palestine. That administration got shut down because of the pressure put on them. So we have to all keep just saying this is about human rights, this is about dignity for all people, this is about respect, has nothing to do with, to the contrary, every activist I work with is fighting against all forms of injustice, and anti-Semitism is one of those. So it's a crude distortion, and it's dangerous, and I think we can't let ourselves be intimidated. And for those of us who feel more vulnerable, then we have to be in community together so that we can really stand with each other at times when we all need to. So that's what I would say. Yeah.
A question that I always have when I'm watching women, especially with the Muslim bandwagon going on, I can't help but asking myself, do you think the media play a role in American foreign policy when it comes to Muslims and discrimination? Like, I always wonder, does it have anything to do with the amount of coverage that you get with one story compared to another story? Because sometimes you have, like, let's say if there's an attack and if the person happens to be Muslim. I feel like the amount of coverage that news have compared to something else that is going on in the news, I always feel like there's always more coverage on the attack on Muslim or whatever it is that might happen that time compared to another. I don't know if I'm making sense.
No, you're making absolute sense.
So I can't help but asking myself, doesn't the media have something to do with it? Because we know that like the media is very influential. They influence people. Do they have a share of that? Like how do we stop that? How do we speak on that?
Right. I think one of the things we can do is because, for example, if you look at when there's any kind of an issue involving Muslims, I don't think I have it with me. The percentage of Muslims that actually get interviewed to talk about the issue is minor. And when there is a Muslim, it's one of the handful picked Muslims who are anti-Muslim, which of course we know. We all have people in our community who are against our own community, you know what I mean? So that's something that we've noticed, that when there, and it's same thing, and it's mainstream media, which is why supporting progressive media. I follow a blog called Mondoweiss on Palestine and Israel, and then a blog called Electronic Intifada. These are two sites where I feel like I can get voices that come out of Palestine, that come out of Israel, that are talking about human rights. They're actually conveying, if there's a protest, that actually talks about the protest and what it was. Like what's going on in Israel, in Gaza right now. The mainstream media is reporting it in a completely false way, in a false narrative. So I think, obviously, the mainstream media is reflecting government and mainstream positions, and it's a serious problem. What I see as part of in our work is to really make sure that we are aware of which media we feel, Democracy Now! Or other places where we feel we can get our media, where we are putting out our voices as much as possible, all those voices that are speaking for justice and are speaking for human rights. And we made a group of us, our organization that were part of Jews Say No, we made a fake New York Times that we passed out on the streets. And for a long time, people thought it was the New York Times. In fact, the New York Times tried to shut it down. But it was, what would a New York Times look like if it had I should have brought an issue today, if it had fair coverage on Israel and Palestine? What would it look like? And we created the whole issue. And it got a lot of buzz and it got a lot of feedback, but we wanted to do it as an example of like how unfair Times coverage is of this issue. And it's the same thing around anything impacting Muslims. And of course, we all know that what's called, I have a problem with the term terrorism at all. I think it's a term that I personally won't use because of for lots of reasons, but the hypocrisy of labeling some things as terrorists when they're done by a Muslim, and the same things or worse done by the almost overwhelming majority of people, white supremacists who are committing these kinds of crimes in the United States. So there's the language that's used. There's lots of good people, though. I'd look for that. I'd make that as a priority. I think challenging the media narrative. You've raised a very important issue, and I urge us all to keep doing it. Thank you. Yeah. There and then there.
It was actually her question, because I was thinking, since 9/11, I lived in New York City. More and more, and even up until today, even the liberal media gets it wrong. There's such ignorance about Muslims and Islam, and it just, you hear it, and if you don't read, if you don't take a class, if you don't know Muslims, you're going to believe what they say. What concerns me more is the fact that the conservative media, like Fox Media, are buying local news stations en masse all over the U.S. and are going to shape the narrative in their view of what Islam and Muslims are. And unfortunately, how do we counteract that? I happen to be one of the lucky ones that has been at this university, that has taken many courses in Islam here, I would say almost all of them, and am involved, in on social justice issues, but most people out there I know are not. But watch tons of TV. We're always on our phones, watching television, network stations. So how do we counteract that narrative? Because voices are getting louder and louder.
No,
And unfortunately, this administration has put people in key places that enlarge those voices and turn it into policy.
I agree with you. It's a very big challenge, and I think that's why so many, or I want to also stress, there are so many social justice organizations across the country that are focusing on how do we get a different narrative out there, how do we get our voices out there. The movement for Black Lives, to me, put out a platform that was so powerful and that went national across the country, so that people in cities across the US were discussing this platform that the mainstream media wasn't going to cover except in negative ways, but not in any positive ways. And I think there's a number of people now organizing in the Muslim community who are like, how do we get, one of the leaders in the Muslim community, a woman, Linda Sarsour, is very much about how do we get other voices out there? How do we really think about how to push ourselves forward? And as it is getting worse and worse. And I think as that repression is happening more and more, those creative ways of thinking of how do we get the narratives out there, how do we get our voices out there, has to be very high on the agenda, and I think it is. I mean, every time I've been going, in South Florida, I hadn't been here for a while, and I was like, I had a little bit of the New York City is the everything thing in me, even though I hated it first when I moved to New York City, and then all of a sudden I realized I was becoming a little New York City centric, and then I came down here, and after the election, and groups were meeting, they were doing immigrant rights groups and racial justice groups, and so many groups were meeting and out on the streets and in Tallahassee and doing all sorts of creative things. So I would say the best way to do it is to connect with groups, and I don't want to minimize about people who are kind and loving and caring, because that's our values too. We want to practice the world we want to live in. And so I'm 62 years old, so I wasn't always this strict, but I literally will not work together on organizing for social justice with people who I don't think are kind, caring, wonderful people. And I don't want to put him on the spot, but I met this wonderful gentleman some year back here when I first came to Miami, and he's introduced me to people, and I was like, whoa, it's like I've been able to meet and connect with so many really caring people. And I felt it today. I was sitting at lunch with a group of people, and I was like, wow, I have to stay more connected to the FIU community, because you could feel that. You could feel the real commitment and the genuineness. So that's what I would say. Keep finding and meeting, and if your group is 5 people, build it from there. That's okay. Everything's doesn't have to be the largest. There's so many, and that's the other thing about organizing. I'm claustrophobic. When I got arrested for civil disobedience, I realized I can't do this again. I was like, especially when they separated me from him. They were like, what do you think, the men and women aren't together? I was like, no, but he's like the one who will keep me calm. So I realized, what? There's not one way to be an activist. There's so many different ways. Some of us write, some of us are out on the streets, some of us, do cultural activities. Some of us just sit in a group and share with each other and build together and are good at just being able to bring communities together. There's so many different ways of standing up for what we believe in, and so I want to just reiterate that too. And those are soulful and spiritual and political and educational and cultural, and so I resist this notion of one way to be an activist, which I think sometimes gets a little crazy. So, yes.
Well, this is kind of advertising to what you just said, but I work for American Friends Service Committee, which is an org that works with Jewish Voices for Peace. And I think it's important what you said to hold their own community accountable. So here in South Florida, we don't have a large Muslim population as the Northeast. So when the Muslim ban started becoming a rising, on television and everything, we saw that on Univision Telemundo, the Latinx community, not all of it, of course, but some there was large support for the Muslim ban. And then it was kind of ironic because as Latinos, we're seen as second-class citizens, no matter legal status. We're still brown, most of us, so they want us out as much as they want Muslim people out. So with American Friends, we're starting this initiative that's sanctuary everywhere. And we want to start going to places of faith and worship, and also schools to teach more about like our initiative, which we want to do. Sanctuary Everywhere was more like not just immigrant rights focused, but we want to focus it with Black Lives Matter, with the issue on police brutality, and also Islamophobia, like challenging those narratives against it. And yeah, we want to start that course now, like to go out in the communities, because we do have to hold ourselves accountable, and you know, everyone has that like racist grandma, grandpa, uncle. So it's kind of like, how do we start those conversations? And although you might not change someone's mind in like, you know, one conversation, but you can open their minds to like a more broader perspective. And that's one of our initiatives. And we do have those posters in our office too.
Oh. Well, first of all, I think AFSC has done for a long time wonderful work and has been consistent partners in all movements for justice. So I'm so happy to meet you and to hear that it's happening. I hadn't met people.
Like our Miami office is like 5 people. And we want to start also like a youth group. We haven't decided, because it's just me and my coworker working on it, we haven't decided if we want to focus on like college youth or like high school youth, but we want to have like a conference in July, June, to like talk about these issues, and also like do like a training, which is like, what would you do on the street if you see someone being harassed, like, you know, Muslim woman being harassed because wearing a hijab, or, you know, something anti-immigrant, or if you see like a black male or black woman getting stopped by the police, like what could you do in that circumstance? So yeah, we can also connect with other people.
That's terrific. And I also think what you're talking about, you know, we can't underestimate the role of community education, of learning together. We've spent a lot of time, if you look on our Jews Against Anti-Muslim Racism website, or the Network Against Islamophobia, we've spent a lot of time developing resources because we feel like we want to be thoughtful and intentional in our work. And we have a lot of workshops together that we all sit together and talk about, what does it mean to do this? How do we want to think about this issue? And I don't think it's some people are like, well, when are you going to be organizing? To me, this is integral to the organizing, because it makes us just really, I mean, I say intentional a lot, but I really am a believer in that, to think about what is the impact of what we're doing? Why are we doing it? How are we actually also, for those of us who aren't the directly impacted community, how do we make sure we both hold our communities accountable, but also respect and honor the leadership of those who are being directly impacted on a daily basis? And that's not just a 5-minute thing. That's about thinking how, I mean, I've been doing this for a while, and every day I'm learning about how to be more thoughtful in how I do this. And in every talk that I give or in conversation, I leave with like, that made me think about this. So I just want to say that I don't think, if people say like community education isn't organizing, I would challenge that notion. And it takes place in lots of places, including, you know, right here where you all spend a bunch of time. Yes.
So kind of expanding upon what I was saying earlier. So there's this organization on campus and campuses throughout the United States called Turning Point USA. And they're not particularly popular on this campus, but they are powerful. They have connections to the Trump administration. I know that Eric Trump has like endorsed their work. And they make this claim that, conservatives and right-wingers are like oppressed on campus, you know, despite the fact that the entire government is opposed to the right wing right now. But what's kind of crazy about them, or what's kind of ridiculous about them, is that there's a leaked internal document from them that was like released by the New Yorker last December, where it showed that they claimed a series of campus victories, and amongst them FIU was included, right? And so like the implication seems to be that they are literally they're funded by energy groups and right wingers, that they're actually funding student government campaigns. And so, you know, my question is like is there like an equivalent, you know, like a group on college campuses that is combating like this phenomenon? Because it's, to me, I just can't help but think of like, you know, like the Hitler Youth, or like, you know, the brown shirts, right? When I hear about these people, you know. What are your thoughts on that?
That's interesting in terms of, I mean, I think one thing is to find out who's on your campus and what they're doing. I think any research, that's the other thing I'm really big on, community research, like to do our homework. I mean, I don't know how many, I was introduced as teaching participatory action research in 2 sentences. That's research that grows out of a community's own wisdom and knowledge as opposed to outside experts coming in and telling a community what they should know. And so I think par on FIU would be like finding out who's funding what on campus, doing a little bit of research to that. That's just one suggestion I'd make. I don't know, Alan, do you have other suggestions of what, kind of like, are you meaning like how to counteract them? So that's, you're thinking of how to counteract. I mean, I think it's just by having strong student groups, on campus. I think the more you've got, and again, share, as you get information, you share it, because often they're hiding behind neutral names. But if you know this is a really racist, reactionary, agenda, put out information to share it.
What's particularly horrifying is that Charlie Kirk, their founder, a man who speaks on college issues, never having attended college himself, just relying on his parents' trust fund, right? The founder of this organization spoke on campus a couple months ago, and Modesto Medic himself was at the Turning Point USA rally with Charlie Kirk. And so, that's the concerning thing to me. It's like, it almost seems like there's this kind of hidden institutional support for groups like these,
But that's something also in terms of, I mean, I've had, just with working with a lot of colleges who have had to hold their administrations accountable as well. I mean, we worked, our daughter was in college where they were not treating activists for Palestine properly. They were really intimidating them and not allowing them to do things. So she and a group got together to go hold the administration accountable. So I think it's just about more and more that you can, the more you learn about what's happening on campus, I think this is your campus. And so you're entitled to know, or even to call a meeting and say, we'd like to know, this is what we think, and we'd like to hear from you. What's going on. I mean, I would think of this, while you're here, the period of time that you're here, this is like a home, and you deserve to be getting, not only getting the education that you deserve, but not having some hidden agenda. I can't speak to it because I don't know enough, but I'd learn more, and I'd share the information, and it might involve meeting with administration and being able to talk about it in an open way, And I think, again, being very, one of the things too that, like I was saying that I'm big on is really doing that research first. Find out what you can, learn what you can. You'd be amazed how much you can learn when you really, just are determined to do that. And then you bringing something into a meeting and that you can say, this is what, and even if it's not all, even if it's some things you heard, but you document it. I'm really big on documentation too. Just to document it and do it, and then keep building your group on campus so that you have more and more students with different perspectives who are like, we may not agree on A and B, but we do agree on this. This is not what our campus should be about. I don't know if that's helpful, but those are my...
Let me just say, your first question was what to do about hate speech on campus, and Donna responded to that. It is going on around the country. I don't know Turning Point in particular, but there's the Federalist Society at some campuses, and the Young Republicans and the Young Conservatives of America. And they're all equal opportunity bigots. They hate women, they hate gays, they hate blacks. So it's not so much organizing against them. It's taking whatever existing activist groups there are, like rights groups and transgender groups and Black Lives Matters, and say, you know the word intersectionality, I'm sure. These guys are going after all of us, and we've got to get together and go after them. And it's that kind of unity among all those that they're going after that I think is going to run all campus.
I agree.
All right. I want to give a round of applause.
Thank you.
Produced by by Academic Video Services within the Division of Information Technology at Florida International University.